There is a low hill in the southeast of Turkey, near the Syrian border, where the land is dry and pale and the wind moves through the grass without ever seeming to hurry. For thousands of years farmers plowed around that hill and shepherds grazed their flocks across it, and nobody thought it was anything but a hill, a slight swelling in the plain, good for nothing in particular, with a few broken slabs of limestone breaking the surface near the top that were a nuisance to the plow. The people who lived nearby called it Göbekli Tepe, which means the hill of the navel or the potbelly hill. Let the room grow quiet around you now, and let the light go low, and let me tell you what was sleeping underneath it, and why the people who put it there wanted it forgotten. Because beneath that entirely ordinary hill there stands a ring of enormous carved stones, raised by human hands 11,600 years ago. That number is the first thing about this place that refuses to make sense, and it is worth letting it settle before we go on, because almost everything else in this story follows from it. 11,600 years. Not a round figure chosen for effect, a date established by radiocarbon measurement of the material sealed inside the walls, checked and rechecked, and now accepted by everyone who works there. It is older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It is older than the Great Pyramid of Giza by 7,000. It is older than writing, older than the wheel, older than pottery, older than the first walled town, older than bronze, older than any king or priest or kingdom whose name has ever come down to us. When these stones were quarried and raised and set into the ground, the last ice age had only just loosened its grip on the world, and the great ice sheets were still melting off the north of Europe. And here is the part that overturned a century of careful thinking. The people who built it were not farmers. They had no fields, no villages in any permanent sense, no domesticated animals except perhaps the dog, no pottery to cook in, no bread as we would recognize it. They were hunters and gatherers, the kind of people that every textbook of the 20th century assumed could not possibly build anything at all, because they had neither the surplus nor the organization nor the reason. For 100 years we told ourselves a tidy story about how civilization began, and the story went in a particular order. First, people learned to farm. Then the surplus food from farming allowed them to stay in one place instead of following the herds. Then the settlements grew into villages and the villages into towns. And only then, when there was stored wealth and leisure, and specialists who did not have to find their own food, and someone in charge, could human beings build temples to their gods. Göbekli Tepe puts the temple first. It stands at the very front of that sequence, built by people who had not yet deliberately planted a single seed, and it asks a question that we have not finished answering and may never answer completely. What if it was not farming that made religion possible, but religion or ceremony, or whatever we should call the impulse that raised these stones that made farming necessary? What if we did not settle down and then start worshipping, but started worshipping and were therefore forced to settle down? The stones themselves are T-shaped pillars of limestone. The largest of them stand 5.5 meters tall, nearly the height of a 2-story house, and weigh something in the region of 10 tons each. They are set into walls of rough stone, standing in circles, and they were cut out of the bedrock of the very same hill using tools of flint and hard round hammerstones held in the hand, because there was no metal anywhere in the world yet for anyone to use. And carved into their sides in low relief are animals. Foxes with their teeth bared and their tails held straight out behind them. Wild boar, heavy-shouldered and low to the ground. Snakes descending the stone in parallel columns, dozens of them, heads pointing downward. Scorpions with their claws spread. Cranes standing very upright. And on one pillar a vulture with its wings open and its left wing bent upward, as though it were lifting something. None of it is decoration. Each figure is placed deliberately, and we do not know what a single one of them means. Then you look more closely at a pillar and everything you thought you were looking at reorganizes itself. Along the narrow sides of the shaft, cut so shallowly that you can miss them in flat light, there are arms. They bend at the elbow. They come around to the front of the stone. And there, meeting just above a carved belt with a buckle on it, are two long-fingered hands. The pillars are not columns holding anything up. They are people or beings shaped like people, standing in a ring facing inward and waiting. There are no houses here, or at least none of the ordinary kind. No domestic hearths in the places you would expect to find them. No rubbish of daily living scattered around doorways. No burials, which is genuinely strange, because in this period people usually buried their dead beneath the floors of the places where they lived. And no water. Not a spring, not a stream, nothing on the hill at all. People came up here and did whatever it was they came to do, and then went away again down the slope. But there are bones. Tens of thousands of them packed into the fill. Gazelle above all, and wild cattle and boar and red deer cracked open for the marrow and burned and thrown down. The wreckage of feasts on a scale that no single family or band could ever have produced or eaten. And there are great vessels cut from single blocks of limestone, standing where they were left, the largest of them holding 160 liters. Something was made in them and shared, and the chemistry suggests it may have been fermented. And then, at some point around 8,000 years before Christ, after more than 1,000 years of gathering and building and feasting on that hill, the people who used it did something that nobody has been able to explain to everyone's satisfaction. They filled the whole thing in. Deliberately. By hand. They carried rubble and broken flint and animal bone and earth up the slope and packed it into the enclosures until the spaces no longer existed and the hill closed over the stones like a lid. That burial is the only reason any of it survived. Everything else that human beings built above ground 11,000 years ago has been worn away to nothing by rain and frost and wind and time. We have almost no monumental architecture from that age anywhere on Earth, and for a long time we assumed that was because there wasn't any. This one was packed in dry rubble and sealed under a hill, and so the carvings stayed sharp, and the pillars stayed standing, and the whole thing simply waited. A survey team walked over this hill in 1963. They saw the broken tops of the pillars pushing through the soil, made an entirely reasonable judgment that they were the remains of a Byzantine cemetery, wrote a short note recording the site, and moved on to look at something else. And for another 31 years, the oldest temple in the world went on being a place where a farmer's plow occasionally caught on something hard, and where the local men would sometimes break up a slab and clear it out of the field. Then in 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt, who had spent years working on Stone Age sites in the same region, read that old survey note, felt something about the description that would not let him alone, drove out to the hill to look for himself, and understood within a single afternoon what he was standing on. He was 41 years old. He would spend the whole of the rest of his life on that hill, and he would die before he had uncovered even a 20th of it. This is the entire story of that place, told slowly and in order. The world that made it, the people who raised it, the animals they carved into it, the feasts they held inside it, the skulls they kept, the reason they may have buried it, and the very large number of questions that remain wide open. There is nothing here you need to remember and nothing you need to follow. If you fall asleep in the first 10 minutes, the hill will still be there. Let it be quiet now and let me begin. To understand what these people did, you have to understand first what kind of world they were standing in, because it was a world in the middle of the largest change it had experienced in something like 100,000 years, and they were living through the hinge of it without any way of knowing that was what was happening. The climate was shifting under their feet. The animals were moving. The plants that grew on the hills were changing which slopes they favored. Everything their grandparents had known was quietly becoming out of date. For most of human existence, the earth had been colder and drier than it is now. Great ice sheets lay across the north of Europe and most of North America, locking up so much water that sea levels stood more than 100 meters lower than today. Britain was not an island, but a peninsula you could walk to across dry land. The Sahara was in places grassland. And human beings lived as they had always lived, in small mobile groups, following the seasons and the herds, hunting and gathering, carrying everything they owned. Then, about 12,000 years ago, the ice began to let go, and it did not do so smoothly. The world warmed, then plunged back into a savage cold snap that lasted more than 1,000 years and is known as the Younger Dryas, and then warmed again, this time for good. The geological period we still live in, the Holocene, begins at almost exactly the moment the first enclosures at Göbekli Tepe were being dug. These people were, quite literally, the first inhabitants of the modern world. And in that newly warming world, one particular region became extraordinarily rich. A great arc of land curving up from the Nile Valley through the Levant, across the top of Mesopotamia and down toward the Persian Gulf, what we have come to call the Fertile Crescent, filled with wild grasses that carried heavy edible seed, with pistachio and almond and terebinth, with gazelle and wild sheep and wild goats, with aurochs and boar in the wetter valleys, and with more standing water than the region has seen since. The hills around Gobekli Tepe sat near the top of that arc, and it is important to understand that they did not look then as they look now. Stand on that hill 11,000 years ago and you would not see the dry, pale, treeless scrub of the modern photographs. You would see open woodland running across the slopes, thick grassland heavy with wild wheat and wild barley, streams that ran through the year, and, twice a year, herds of gazelle moving across the plain below in numbers that are difficult for us now to picture. This matters enormously, and it is the point most often missed. It means the people here were not scraping a living at the edge of starvation. Anthropologists who have studied hunter-gatherers in rich environments consistently find the same thing. They work fewer hours than farmers do, they eat a considerably more varied diet, they suffer less from famine, and their skeletons show better health. What such people have, and what farming societies almost never have, is the one resource you need for a project like this: spare time. And they were not wanderers in the restless way we sometimes imagine when we hear the word nomad. When the food comes to you, when the gazelle migrate past your particular valley every spring, when the almonds ripen on the same slopes every autumn, when the fish run in the same month each year, you do not need to travel very far at all. You can occupy a single region for generation after generation, moving between a handful of known camps, until you know every rock and spring and thicket in it by name. They possessed knowledge that we have almost entirely lost and could not now recover. Which plants heal a wound and which stop a heart. Where water sits beneath dry ground in a bad year. How a gazelle herd will turn if you come at it from a particular direction with the wind in a particular quarter. When the cranes arrive. How to strike a flint core so that the flake comes away with an edge sharper than surgical steel. And the names, we can be quite certain they had names. For every hill and spring and stand of trees in a landscape they had known for 1,000 years. What they did not have was almost everything we habitually use as the definition of civilization. No writing of any kind. No metal, not even soft copper. No pottery, which means no waterproof cooking vessel that can sit in a fire. No wheel and nothing to pull one if they had it. No domesticated animals except, probably, the dog. No permanent architecture. No bread as we know it. Their entire technology was stone, bone, antler, wood, hide, plant fiber, and fire, and with that toolkit they were entirely capable of everything you are about to hear. Because with exactly that toolkit in exactly that world, somebody decided that the correct thing to do next was to quarry 10-ton pillars out of solid limestone using nothing but handheld stones, carve them with images of dangerous animals, drag them several hundred meters uphill, stand them upright in a ring on top of a hill where nobody lived and where there was no water, and then to keep doing it in the same way for the next 1,600 years. So who were they? We have no name for them, and we never will. They left no word that we can read, no myth that survived, no king list, no genealogy. Everything we will ever know about them has to be dug out of the ground and inferred, and every inference is provisional. They are among the last human beings of whom this is true. After them, the record thickens and the voices start, faintly, to come through. These people are on the far side of that line in silence. But the ground says a great deal if you know how to ask it. From their bones we know they were tall and strongly built, and better nourished than the farming populations who would occupy the same valleys 2,000 years later. From the wear on their teeth we know they ate a wide range of plant foods along with a great deal of meat, and that their diet was gritty with the stone dust that comes off a grinding slab. And from their shoulders, arms, and spines we know that a good many of them did extremely heavy physical work. Their tools were made of flint and of obsidian volcanic glass, which takes an edge finer than anything else available in the ancient world. And the obsidian is quietly interesting because it does not occur anywhere near Göbekli Tepe. It comes from volcanic sources 100 kilometers away and more in central and eastern Anatolia. Either these people traveled those distances themselves, or they were connected to others who did. This was not an isolated pocket of humanity. Things moved across this landscape, and so, we can be sure, did ideas. They hunted gazelle above everything else. More than half of all the identifiable animal bone recovered from the site is gazelle, and the ages at which those animals died cluster in a way that points to two particular seasons, the times when the great herds passed through the plain on migration. They also took aurochs, the enormous wild cattle whose bulls stood nearly 2 meters at the shoulder and which are genuinely dangerous to approach with a spear, along with wild boar, red deer, wild sheep, and birds by the hundred. And they gathered, which was probably the larger part of the diet, even though it leaves less dramatic traces. Wild einkorn and emmer wheat, wild barley, pistachios, almonds, lentils, wild vetch, and a range of roots and greens that have left almost no trace at all. Grinding stones turn up at the site in very large numbers, hundreds of them, worn into hollows by use, some of them broken and reused as building material. Somebody on that hill spent an enormous number of hours crushing seed into meal. Their clothing was hide and fur, sewn with bone needles using sinew or plant fiber, and possibly some woven or plaited fabric of the kind that does not survive. They wore ornaments, beads of stone and shell and animal tooth, pendants, small carved objects. And they made figurines, little sculptures of animals, mostly, along with a small number of human figures, some of which are startlingly expressive for objects a few centimeters tall. They lived, as far as we can reconstruct it, in scattered camps and small settlements down in the surrounding valleys, in round or oval huts partly sunk into the ground with roofs of branches, reed and hide. Several of these settlements have been excavated: Navali Quarry, Keonu, Halan Semi, Jerf El Ahmar. None of them held more than a few dozen people at a time. All of them lie within a day or two's walk of the hill. And into that ordinary, mobile, extremely ancient way of life came something entirely new. A project that would require hundreds of people working together for weeks at a stretch, repeated across generations, for no material return whatsoever. Nothing built on that hill would feed anybody. Nothing would shelter anybody from rain or cold. Nothing would store grain, keep out enemies, hold water, or make the next winter easier in any way that we can identify. That is the strangest single fact about Gobekli Tepe, and it is worth sitting with before we go any further, because everything else is a footnote to it. This place is not a tool. It has no practical function that 30 years of excavation has been able to identify. It is the earliest surviving evidence of human beings pouring an enormous quantity of effort into something that exists for no reason except that they believed it ought to exist. And whatever it was they believed, it was strong enough to move 10 tons of limestone uphill without wheels, without draft animals, without metal, without rope of any material we would consider adequate, and without, as far as we can tell, anybody in charge who could compel anyone to do anything. And it was strong enough to keep doing that, in the same forms with the same symbols, for longer than the entire span of time separating us from the Roman Empire. The story of how this place was found is almost as strange as the thing that was found, and it begins with a careful, competent survey that walked straight over the top of it and saw nothing. That is not a criticism of the people who did it. It is a lesson about how much of what we see depends on what we already believe is possible, and it applies to us as much as to them. In 1963, a joint team from the University of Chicago and Istanbul University was working its way across southeastern Turkey, recording archaeological sites ahead of development. They came up onto this hill, noted the broken slabs of worked limestone protruding from the soil near the summit, and made an entirely reasonable judgment. This was a medieval cemetery, and the slabs were the tops of gravestones. They recorded it in their notes, assigned it a site number, and moved on to the next mound. It was a completely understandable mistake, and it is worth being clear about why. The tops of the T-shaped pillars are plain. The horizontal block has no carving on its upper surface, and where it breaks ground it looks exactly like a flat slab set on end. There was no reason on earth for anyone in 1963 to imagine that beneath each of those slabs stood 5 meters of carved limestone from the end of the last ice age, because at that date, nobody believed such a thing could exist anywhere. Meanwhile, the local farmers went on farming. Over the following decades, some of the exposed stone was broken up with sledgehammers and hauled away, because a hard slab in the middle of a field is an obstacle you remove. Villagers later told the excavators that this had been going on for years. It is a small miracle that so much survived, and it means that some pillars, the ones that stood highest and were therefore most in the way, have been lost entirely and will never be recorded. 30 years after that survey, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt was working 40 kilometers away at a site called Navel Quarry, an early Neolithic settlement in the Euphrates Valley that was about to disappear forever beneath the reservoir of the Ataturk Dam. He had found something remarkable there. A small building with T-shaped pillars set into its walls, and one of them carved with human arms. It was the first hint anywhere that such things existed. When the water rose over Navel Quarry, Schmidt needed a new site. He went through the old survey reports for the region, looking for anything of the right period, and he came across the 1963 note about limestone slabs on a hill near Sanliurfa. Something in the wording would not leave him alone. He had just spent years handling exactly this kind of material, and he knew what a plain limestone slab could turn out to be the top of. He drove out to the hill in October 1994. He said afterwards that he understood almost immediately. He walked over the ground and found flint everywhere, thousands of pieces of worked stone scattered across the surface, and all of it from the wrong period entirely for a medieval cemetery. He looked at the shape of the mound itself, too round and too regular to be natural. And he looked at the exposed slabs and recognized them. He described the moment afterwards in very plain terms. He had a choice, he said, standing on that hill. He could walk away and say nothing and find an easier site, or he could spend the rest of his life here. He knew even then that it would be the rest of his life, because whatever was under that hill was clearly enormous, and excavating it properly would take longer than one career. He chose the hill. The first excavation season opened the following year, in partnership with the German Archaeological Institute and Saint-Lierfe Museum. Almost as soon as the trenches went in, they ran into standing stone, and then into carving, and then into a pillar with a fox on it, and the dating came back from the laboratory, and the certainty arrived very fast indeed. This was Stone Age. It was monumental. And those two words had never been allowed to sit next to each other before. Klaus Schmidt worked on Göbekli Tepe for 19 years, season after season, publishing carefully and refusing to be hurried. He died suddenly in July 2014, at the age of 60, of a heart attack while swimming on holiday in Germany, a few weeks before the season was due to start. By that point, he had uncovered something like 5% of the site. The other 95% is still there, in the dark, exactly as it was left. Picture the hill as the excavation slowly revealed it, because the shape of the thing matters. It is roughly 300 meters across and about 15 meters high, standing on the highest point of a limestone ridge with a view across the Heron Plain in every direction. And here is the first surprise. Most of that 15 meters is not natural. The hill is very largely composed of material that people carried up and put there. Beneath the topsoil lie the enclosures. They are roughly oval or circular spaces, ranging from about 10 to 30 meters across, bounded by walls built of rough limestone blocks, with a low stone bench running around the inside of the wall like seating. And set into those walls at regular intervals, with the wall built up around them, stand the T-shaped pillars, always facing inward, always looking toward the middle of the space. And in the center of each enclosure stand two more pillars, larger than all the others, set on carved stone pedestals, standing side by side and parallel to one another with perhaps 2 meters between them, and facing the entrance. Every line of the design points at these two. Whatever the ring of smaller figures around the wall represents, the whole arrangement is gathered around this central pair, and they are unmistakably the most important things in the space. 4 of these great enclosures have now been fully excavated, and they were given plain working letters as they were found: A, B, C, and D. Enclosure D is the largest and by far the best preserved, and its 2 central pillars stand 5.5 meters tall from their pedestals. Standing at the bottom of that excavation and looking up at them is the closest anyone alive will come to the experience the builders had. And then, in the early 2000s, geophysical survey found the rest. Ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry, instruments that map what lies beneath the soil without disturbing a grain of it, were walked across the unexcavated parts of the mound, and the readings came back showing structure after structure. There are at least 15 more enclosures under that hill, and something in the order of 200 more pillars, still buried. 200 pillars. Each one quarried out of solid rock with handheld stones, shaped on all 4 sides, carved with animals, dragged several hundred meters, and raised upright into a socket by people with no metal, no wheel, and no draft animals. And the 4 enclosures that have been excavated, the ones in every photograph you have ever seen of this site, represent about 5% of what is there. The layers matter too, and they tell a story of their own. The oldest structures, the great round enclosures with the tallest pillars, lie at the bottom and date to roughly 9600 to 8800 BC. Above them, later in time, are smaller rectangular rooms with smaller and planar pillars, dating to somewhere between 8800 and 800 BC. In total, the site was in use for something like 1600 years, which is longer than the gap between us and the fall of Rome. And here is a detail that has quietly bothered archaeologists ever since it became clear. The oldest enclosures are the largest, the most ambitious, and the most finely carved. The work does not improve over time, as you would expect if people were learning. It gets smaller, simpler, plainer, and less ambitious with every century. Whatever this was, it began at its peak and then slowly, over more than a millennium, wound down. That is not how skills usually develop, and it raises an uncomfortable question. It suggests that the builders arrived at this hill with the ability already in their hands, which means they learned it somewhere else on something else before this. If there is an earlier phase, a first attempt, a place where people worked out how to do this, then nobody has found it, and it may lie under any one of 1,000 unexcavated mounds in that landscape. And then, at the end of all of it, the whole complex was buried by the people who had built it, and the hill became a hill again and stayed one for 10,000 years while everything else on Earth happened. Stand in enclosure D in your mind at night, with the excavation lights off and the wind moving across the rim of the trench, and look carefully at what surrounds you, because this is the heart of the whole site and every detail of it was chosen. 12 pillars are set into the enclosure wall around you, spaced evenly, each one facing inward toward the center where you are standing. They are between 3 and 4 meters tall. Between them, the wall is built up in rough limestone blocks, and along the base of the wall runs a low stone bench, wide enough to sit on, continuous around the whole circuit except where the entrance breaks it. And at the center, standing alone on carved stone pedestals, are 2 pillars of a different order altogether. 5.5 meters of shaped limestone each, something like 10 tons apiece, parallel to one another and about 2 meters apart, facing the same direction. They dominate the space completely. Whatever happened in this enclosure, it happened in front of these 2, and they were watching it. Their shape is unmistakable, and it is important to understand that it is not architectural. A T-shaped pillar is a tall flat shaft with a broad horizontal block on top of it, and that block is not a capital supporting a roof. Nothing rests on it. Nothing ever rested on it. The T is not a structural solution to a problem. The T is the point. Somebody wanted the stone to be that shape and shaped it accordingly. Then you notice the carving on the narrow sides, and the whole thing reorganizes itself in front of you. Running down the length of the shaft, cut in very low relief, is a pair of arms. They come down the sides, bend at the elbow and turn inward, and they come around onto the front of the pillar. And there, meeting just above a carved belt, are two long-fingered hands with the fingers extended and almost touching. So the horizontal block on top is a head, seen from the front with the shoulders below it. The shaft is a body. The pillar is a standing figure, enormously tall, faceless, wearing a belt with a decorated buckle and, hanging from the belt, what appears to be a loincloth or apron of animal skin, carved with the texture of a pelt. On the belt of one of the central pillars in enclosure D there are carved symbols, spaced evenly around it, that nobody has been able to interpret. And they have no faces. This is not damage or weathering. You can see, from the sharpness of everything else, that no face was ever carved. The head is a plain rectangular block. Whatever these beings were, they were deliberately given no eyes and no mouth, by people who were perfectly capable of carving a fox's bared teeth or a crane's eye in fine detail on the very same stone. Around the neck of each of the two central pillars in enclosure D there is something like a pendant on a cord, a curved shape resembling the letter H turned onto its side, with a crescent and a disc beside it. The same H shape turns up on other pillars at other sites on objects. It is used repeatedly and consistently across a whole region and several centuries, which means it was a symbol with a fixed meaning. We have no idea what that meaning was. So consider the arrangement as a whole. Two enormous figures at the center standing side by side. A ring of smaller figures around the wall, all of them turned inward. And a low bench running around the base, as though for people to sit on. It looks unmistakably like a gathering, an assembly of some kind, of beings who are not present in the ordinary way, held permanently in stone, around a space that living people could enter. And notice what that arrangement does to a person standing in the middle of it. You are surrounded by silent figures 3 to 5 times your own height, and every single one of them is turned toward you. Whether the effect they wanted was protection or judgment or witness or simple company, that is the effect the architecture produces, and they built it that way more than a dozen times. Everything on that hill came out of that hill. Walk a few hundred meters from the enclosures across the limestone plateau and you come to the quarries. Shallow scars in the bedrock where the stone was taken, and lying in them, still where they were left, are pillars that never made the journey. The largest of them is still attached to the bedrock along its base, fully shaped on the other 3 sides, waiting to be undercut and freed. It is 7 meters long, and if it had ever been finished and stood upright it would have weighed something close to 50 tons. Something stopped the work, a crack in the stone, a change of plan, a death, a decision we cannot recover, and it has lain there ever since, half born out of the rock. The method they used is still visible in the rock face, and it is brutally simple. Using hammerstones, hard, round, fist-sized cobbles held in the hand, thousands of which have been recovered from the site, a great many of them broken from use, they pounded a channel into the limestone all the way around the outline of the pillar. Not cutting, pulverizing. Reducing solid rock to powder, grain by grain, by hitting it. It is difficult to overstate how slow this is. Experimental archaeologists have tried it with replica tools, and the estimates that come back suggest that quarrying a single large pillar in this way takes a team of workers something in the order of weeks of continuous labor. And that is before any shaping, any carving, any transport, and any of the extremely dangerous business of standing the thing upright. Then the pillar had to be freed from the bedrock underneath it. They worked in from the sides, undercutting the block, and at some point applied enough force along the base to snap it away cleanly. Wooden levers, wedges driven into cracks, possibly wooden wedges soaked in water so that the swelling timber split the stone along a line. All of these are known techniques from later periods, and all of them would work here. And then they had to move 10 tons of limestone, sometimes considerably more, without wheels, without draft animals, without metal, across several hundred meters of rough ground, and uphill. We do not know exactly how they did it, and honesty is better than invention here. But the possibilities are not mysterious, only laborious. Wooden rollers cut from tree trunks. Sledges of heavy timber dragged over packed earth or over a prepared trackway. Ropes twisted from plant fiber or cut from hide. Levers. Timber cribbing to raise and lower. And a very large number of people pulling together in rhythm. Estimates for the workforce required vary considerably, but the lowest serious figure for moving one of the larger pillars is somewhere around 500 people working in coordination. Some estimates run higher. And that is for the moving alone, not the quarrying, not the carving, not the feeding of everybody while it happens. 500 people is not a family group. It is not even a band. It is more people than lived in any single settlement we know of anywhere in that region at that time, which means they came from many different settlements spread over a wide area, and somebody or something persuaded all of them to arrive at the same place at the same time and pull on a rope. And every one of them had to be fed while they were there. Hundreds of people camped on a dry hill for weeks at a stretch, eating gazelle and wild cattle and boar and ground wild grain, all of which had to be hunted, gathered, carried up the slope and cooked. Seen in that light, the enormous deposits of feasting debris are not a curious sidelight to the archaeology. They are the payroll. Then, at the end of all that, the pillar had to be stood upright and lowered into a socket cut into the bedrock floor, the single most dangerous moment of the entire operation, when 10 tons of stone is somewhere between horizontal and vertical, held by ropes and timber props and human bodies, and one mistake kills whoever is underneath it. And they did this, as far as we can tell, more than 200 times. Now to the carvings, which are the closest thing to a message that this place has left us, and which we cannot read at all. The animals are carved in low relief on the broad faces and narrow sides of the pillars, and occasionally fully in the round, projecting out from the stone as sculpture. They are done with genuine skill. The proportions are right, the postures are alive and specific, and whoever made them plainly knew these creatures intimately. The way a fox holds its tail when it is moving, the set of a boar's shoulders, the angle of a crane's neck. Foxes appear more often than almost anything else. They are usually shown in profile, running or standing, with the mouth open and the teeth clearly shown and the tail held straight out behind. On one of the central pillars of enclosure a fox is carved in the crook of the great figure's arm, positioned exactly as though the being were holding it against its side. Snakes come in numbers. They are usually shown descending the pillar in parallel columns, heads pointing downward, sometimes a dozen or more together like falling rain, sometimes converging on a single point or a single animal. On one pillar there are so many that the stone seems to be moving. The snakes of that region are mostly not dangerous, which makes the emphasis harder to explain. Wild boar appear heavy and low, with their tusks and the bristled ridge along the back. Aurochs appear, the huge wild cattle, extinct since the 17th century, usually with the head lowered and the horns forward in the posture of a charge. Both of these are genuinely dangerous animals, and both are shown in threatening attitudes rather than as prey being taken. Cranes and other long-legged birds are carved with a peculiar upright bearing that several researchers have thought looks deliberately human, and cranes do have a courtship dance that is startlingly like human dancing, which people who lived alongside them would certainly have known. Ducks appear. Vultures appear, wings spread. Scorpions are carved with their claws out and their tails segmented and raised. Spiders appear. And on one pillar, in a position of considerable prominence, there is a single large scorpion carved beneath the figure of a headless human being, one of very few human figures anywhere on the site. And here is the pattern that turns these carvings from beautiful into genuinely strange, and it is the single most important observation anyone has made about them. They did not carve what they ate. More than half of all the animal bone recovered from Göbekli Tepe is gazelle. Gazelle was the staple. Gazelle was what these people hunted, killed, carried up the hill, roasted and ate in enormous quantities at every gathering. And gazelle almost never appears in the carvings. Instead, the stone is covered with predators, scavengers, venomous creatures and dangerous beasts. Foxes, snakes, scorpions, spiders, boar, aurochs, vultures. So whatever this is, it is not hunting magic, and it is not a record of a successful season, and it is certainly not a menu. The animals on these pillars are not food. They are something else entirely, powers, perhaps, or spirits, or the emblems of particular groups, or characters in a story that every single person standing in that enclosure already knew by heart and had known since childhood. And the choices differ systematically from one enclosure to another, which is a real clue. Enclosure A is dominated by snakes. Enclosure B by foxes. Enclosure C by wild boar. Enclosure D has the widest range of any, with birds especially prominent. Whether that reflects different groups, different families, different seasons, different gods, or different generations, we genuinely cannot say. What we can say is that somebody chose. On a hill where every single mark cost hours of patient pounding with a handheld stone, nothing here is accidental, and nothing here is filler. Every animal on every pillar is there because a decision was made to put it there by a person who had a reason. One pillar in enclosure D has drawn more attention than everything else on the site put together, and it deserves its own quiet chapter. It is known officially as Pillar 43 and popularly as the Vulture Stone, and it is the single most densely carved object to survive from the Stone Age anywhere in the world. Its entire broad face is covered in relief carving, edge to edge, in a way that no other pillar at the site attempts. Along the top run 3 rectangular shapes with rounded corners, and standing on each one is an animal, like 3 baskets or 3 bags or 3 containers of some kind, each with a creature on top of it. Nobody knows what the rectangles are. Below them, a vulture dominates the center of the composition. Its wings are spread wide, and the left wing is bent sharply upward at the joint in a way that reads unmistakably, to a human eye, as an arm raising something. And resting on that upraised wing there is a disc, a plain circle carved in relief, sitting on the wing as though being held out, or lifted or offered. Beside the vulture are other birds and a snake and various shapes that resist identification. And at the lower right, small enough that people miss it in photographs, is the figure of a headless human being with what appears to be an erect phallus, one of the very few human figures carved anywhere on this hill, and the only one on this pillar. Below the vulture there is a scorpion, and a long-necked bird with its head bent down toward the ground, and further shapes that have been read as everything from a wolf's head to an abstract symbol to a piece of clothing. The lower part of the pillar is damaged, and some of the composition is lost for good. Now, vultures had a particular significance across the Neolithic Near East, and it is not the significance we give them. At sites throughout the region, most famously Çatalhöyük in central Anatolia, where wall paintings show vultures over headless human figures, the bird is associated with the treatment of the dead. There is good evidence that in several of these cultures, bodies were exposed for the birds to strip before the bones were gathered up. So the reading that most specialists in this site find plausible is that the Vulture Stone has something to do with death. A body given up. A soul being carried. The disc on the upraised wing standing for whatever it was they believed left a person at the end, and the headless figure below standing for what remains behind when it has gone. Other readings exist, and one of them has traveled a very long way beyond archaeology. In 2017, 2 engineers published a paper arguing that the animals on this pillar are constellations, and that the stone records the date of a comet impact around 10,900 BC. It was covered by newspapers all over the world and is probably the single most widely believed thing about Göbekli Tepe. It is worth being careful here, because this site attracts more speculation than almost any place on Earth, and the speculation tends to crowd out the actual evidence. Specialists in the site have criticized the comet reading on several grounds. The animal-to-constellation matching is arbitrary and can be done with almost any set of images. The pillar is not securely dated to the year required, and the site's own excavators consider it unsupported. The honest position is less dramatic and considerably more interesting. We have a beautifully carved stone, made by people whose minds we cannot enter, using a symbolic language that was completely legible to everyone who saw it and is completely illegible to us. It says something specific. We do not know what. That is not a failure of archaeology. It is simply how far back this is, and how completely the words have gone. For most of the first 2 decades of work, the guiding interpretation of Gobekli Tepe was that it was a temple and nothing else, a sacred hill with no settlement on it, visited by people who lived elsewhere and came here for ceremonies. Klaus Schmidt described it as a cathedral on a hill and argued firmly and repeatedly that nobody had ever lived on it. The evidence for that view is real, and it is worth setting out. There are no clear house floors in the great enclosures. There are no domestic hearths in the places you would expect to find them if families were cooking daily meals. There are no burials, which is genuinely remarkable, because in this period across this whole region people habitually buried their dead beneath the floors of their houses. And there is no water source anywhere on the hill. That last point carries real weight. There is no spring on Göbekli Tepe, and no stream. The nearest reliable water lies some distance away and considerably downhill. To live there permanently would mean carrying every drop of water you drank, cooked with and washed in up a slope every single day forever, which is possible but is the kind of cost that people only accept for a very good reason. But research since Schmidt's death has complicated the picture considerably, and good archaeology follows the evidence even when it dismantles a beautiful idea. Later work has identified cisterns cut into the bedrock to catch and hold rainwater, along with channels cut to guide water into them. And in the newer, upper layers of the site there are rectangular buildings that look a great deal more domestic than ceremonial. Grinding stones turn up in the thousands. There are traces of cooking. There is debris that looks like ordinary living rather than ritual. The current view among the people digging there now is that at least some people were on that hill for extended periods, doing everyday things, and that the sharp division between sacred site and settlement may be a modern imposition. So the interpretation has softened from temple, no houses, into something more nuanced. It may have been a place where large numbers gathered at particular seasons and camped for the duration. It may have had a small permanent population who maintained it. It may have been both of these things at different points across 1600 years, which is a very long time for any single explanation to hold. And that last observation may be the most important thing in this chapter, because it applies to everything else we say about these people. The division between temple and house, between sacred and ordinary, between religion and daily life, is our division. There is no particular reason to think it existed for them at all, and quite a lot of anthropology suggesting that for most human societies it has not. What remains true, whatever the settlement debate concludes, is the essential strangeness of the thing. This is a complex built at enormous cost on a hill with no water, in a form with no practical use, by people who did not live there in any ordinary sense. And they kept coming back to it and adding to it and rebuilding it for 16 centuries. If you want to know what actually happened on that hill, not what it meant but what people physically did there, the best evidence is not the carvings at all. It is the rubbish. The fill that buried the enclosures contains an enormous quantity of animal bone, tens of thousands of identifiable fragments, and a great deal more that is too broken to identify. And crucially, these are not the bones of animals that died there naturally. They are butchery waste. They carry cut marks from flint blades. They have been smashed open for the marrow. Many are burned. This is the wreckage of meals on a scale that requires a crowd. Gazelle dominates the assemblage, and the ages at death of the gazelle bones cluster in a way that points firmly to two particular windows in the year, the periods when the migrating herds cross the plain. The great gatherings on this hill, it appears, were timed to the movement of the animals, which is exactly what you would expect of people who needed to feed several hundred guests at once. Aurochs appear in quantity too, which is significant in a different way. A single aurochs bull represents several hundred kilograms of meat. You do not kill one to feed a family. The meat would spoil long before you finished it. You kill one because a crowd is coming, and because bringing down a 2-meter wild bull with flint-tipped spears is itself an event that people will talk about for years afterwards. And then there are the vessels. Large basins cut from single blocks of limestone, standing in and around the enclosures where they were left. Several of them survive. The largest holds about 160 liters, an amount that no household would ever need, and that requires a considerable effort simply to fill. Chemical analysis of residues scraped from the inside of some of these basins has identified calcium oxalate, a compound that forms when cereals are soaked, malted, and fermented. The researchers who published it were careful about their claims, and the finding is not beyond dispute. But the most straightforward reading of the evidence is that these vessels held something very like beer. Think about what that means and how early it is. Before farming, before pottery, before bread as we would recognize it. People were gathering wild grain from the hillsides, soaking it, letting it ferment in enormous stone bowls, and drinking the result together inside a ring of carved figures. If it is right, this is the oldest evidence for alcohol anywhere in the world. This gives us a picture of the place that feels human rather than mystical, and it is probably closer to the truth than anything more solemn. Crowds arriving on foot from a wide region at an appointed time of year. Hunting on a scale that no single band could organize alone. Roasting, feasting, talking, and, if the great limestone basins mean what they appear to mean, a certain amount of drinking. And it is in exactly that setting that the work gets done. This is how you move 50-ton stones without kings, without slaves, and without any means of compelling anybody to do anything. You throw an enormous party, and the building is part of the party, and everybody goes home afterwards having been present at something that mattered and having eaten better than they will eat again for months. It also solves a genuine problem that hunter-gatherer societies face. Small mobile groups need to meet other groups. They need to exchange news, trade obsidian and flint, settle disputes before they become feuds, and above all find husbands and wives outside their own band. A place that reliably gathers everybody in one spot at one time each year is not a luxury for such people. It is essential social infrastructure, and it may be that the temple was the machinery that made a whole society possible. There is one more category of evidence from this hill, and it is the strangest thing that has come out of the ground there. Among the bone recovered from the fill are fragments of human skull. Not many, around 700 fragments across all excavation, from a minimum of several individuals, but 3 of them are carved. Not damaged, not weathered, not gnawed. deliberately incised with deep grooves running front to back across the vault of the skull, cut with a flint blade after the flesh had gone. One of the three has, in addition, a hole drilled through the left parietal bone. It is a neat, deliberate perforation of exactly the kind and exactly the position you would choose if you wanted to hang something on a cord and have it hang straight. The grooves are deep enough to hold a fiber in place and stop it slipping. The interpretation published by the excavation team in 2017 is the most direct one available. These skulls were prepared for display. They were suspended or carried or bound to something, and the modification was carried out with care by somebody who had done it before. This gives Gobekli Tepe the earliest known evidence anywhere of what archaeologists call a skull cult, and it is not an isolated oddity. It belongs to a very widespread pattern across the Neolithic Near East. In culture after culture in this period, skulls were removed from bodies sometime after burial, kept above ground, sometimes modified, and held among the living rather than left with the dead. At Jericho, a couple of thousand years later, skulls were coated in plaster and modeled into faces, with cowrie shells set into the eye sockets. At Catalhoyuk, a woman was buried cradling a plastered skull in her arms. At Navel, Quarry, just down the valley from Göbekli Tepe, skulls were kept in a special building. Whatever the specific belief was, it was shared across a very large area for a very long time. Whether the Göbekli Tepe skulls belonged to revered ancestors or to defeated enemies, we cannot tell. Both practices are known ethnographically, and the physical evidence looks much the same either way. But it fits with everything else on this hill. The headless human figure on the Vulture Stone, the vultures themselves with their wings spread, the great faceless figures standing in their rings. A picture assembles itself very dimly out of all this, and it should be held loosely. A place concerned above all with the dead. With ancestors, perhaps, standing in stone around the living. With bodies given to the birds and skulls kept back and carried. With the boundary between those who are here now and those who came before being deliberately, ceremonially, permanently thin. And notice the inversion at the center of it. The great stone figures have no faces at all, while actual human heads were carved, drilled, and hung. It is a haunting arrangement, and it may mean nothing whatsoever, and we will almost certainly never know. Now we come to the part of the story that reaches out beyond this one hill and changes the shape of everything that follows in human history, including, in a direct line, the food you last ate. 30 kilometers from Gobekli Tepe there is a low volcanic mountain called Karahan. It is not much to look at. A long, dark basalt ridge lying across the plain, unremarkable in every way, with scrubby slopes and a scatter of villages around its feet. In 1997, a team of geneticists set out to find the wild ancestor of domesticated einkorn wheat. They compared the DNA of modern cultivated einkorn against wild einkorn populations gathered from all across the Near East, looking for the closest match, the specific wild population from which the domesticated crop had descended. They found it growing on the slopes of Karahan, which is to say, the wild ancestor of one of the world's first domesticated crops grows within sight of the world's oldest temple, and the two of them are contemporary with each other. Stand on the pillars at Göbekli Tepe on a clear day and you are looking at the mountain where bread began. And it gets more specific still. This same region has produced the earliest evidence for domesticated einkorn wheat, and nearby sites document early stages in the domestication of cattle, pigs, and sheep. This corner of southeastern Anatolia is one of the places, quite possibly the central place, where agriculture was invented, and with it everything that agriculture made possible. So we have, in one small region, within a few dozen kilometers and a few centuries of one another, the world's first monumental architecture and the world's first farming. Two of the most consequential things human beings have ever done, appearing side by side in the same landscape at the same moment. That cannot reasonably be coincidence. And so the question becomes, which way does the causation run? The traditional answer, held with great confidence through most of the 20th century, was that farming came first and made everything else possible. People learned to grow food. Growing food produced a surplus. The surplus permitted permanent settlement. Settlement permitted specialists who did not grow their own food, priests, chiefs, craftsmen. And those specialists, with the surplus behind them, eventually built monuments. Göbekli Tepe breaks that chain at the first link because the monument is unambiguously there before the farming. The people who quarried these pillars were hunting gazelle and gathering wild grain. There was no agricultural surplus in the sense that the old model required. There was no village. There was no elite class living off anybody else's harvest, because there were no harvests. So Klaus Schmidt proposed the reverse, and it became one of the great arguments in modern archaeology. What if the temple came first, and farming was invented because of it? What if the causation runs the other way entirely? The logic runs like this. To build and maintain a place like this, hundreds of people had to gather repeatedly, and to stay for weeks at a time while the work was done. Those people had to be fed for the duration. And wild resources, however rich, are finite in any one location. A crowd of 500 exhausts the gazelle, and the nut trees and the wild grain stands around a single hill very quickly indeed. The wild wheat was already growing on the hills nearby. People were already gathering it and grinding it and clearly eating a lot of it. The sustained pressure of feeding these gatherings, year after year for centuries, may have pushed them from simply gathering wild stands toward tending them, clearing competing plants, protecting the best patches, and replanting seed from the plants that held onto their grain instead of scattering it. Do that for a few hundred years without any intention of inventing anything, and you have domesticated wheat. Grain that stays on the stalk until you cut it. Then fields, because tended plants do better in one place. Then harvests, then storage, and then, inevitably, people living beside the fields all year round because you cannot leave a crop unguarded. In this reading, the deepest transformation in the entire human story, the shift from foraging to farming, which produced villages, then cities, then states, then writing, then armies, then everything since, did not begin with hunger or with clever invention or with climate change. It began with belief. with people needing to gather in one particular place for a reason that had nothing at all to do with food, and then discovering that they needed to eat. It is a striking idea, and it deserves to be handled honestly. It is a hypothesis, not a demonstrated fact. Some archaeologists find it compelling. Others think it overstates the case and argue that climate, rising population, and the natural richness of the region did most of the work, with the temple as a symptom of the change rather than its cause. But even the skeptics accept the core point, and it is not a small one. The old model, farming first, everything else afterwards, cannot survive this hill. Something considerably more complicated happened here, and religion or ceremony, or whatever we should call the thing that made people move 10-ton stones, was present at the very beginning of it rather than arriving comfortably afterwards. It is worth stopping here for a moment because we habitually tell the story of agriculture as pure progress, as the moment humanity finally got organized, and the skeletons say something rather different. The hunter-gatherers who built Göbekli Tepe were, on the evidence of their own bones, taller, stronger, and better nourished than the farming populations who occupied the very same valleys 1,000 years later. This is not a marginal difference, and it is not disputed. The arrival of agriculture in this region is visible in the human skeleton as a decline. Early farming populations across the Near East show reduced stature, considerably more tooth decay from a starchy diet, more anemia, more signs of periodic starvation written into the growth lines of their bones, and far more evidence of infectious disease. That last because people were now living densely in permanent settlements alongside their animals and their own accumulated waste. They also worked very much harder. Foraging in a rich landscape occupies a few hours a day and leaves the rest for talking, making things, and doing nothing. Farming takes everything. Clearing, breaking ground, sowing, weeding, guarding against birds and animals, harvesting in a narrow window, threshing, winnowing, storing, and then beginning again with the constant knowledge that one bad season means a hungry year. And it introduced something the foraging world had largely done without: storable, ownable wealth. Grain in a pit is property. Property can be inherited, defended, taken, and accumulated unequally. From there, it is a short road to some families having more than others, and from there to hierarchy, and from hierarchy eventually to everything hierarchy makes possible, including organized warfare and slavery. So the transition was not obviously an improvement for the people who lived through it, and this is one of the genuine puzzles of prehistory. It looks less like a triumph and more like a trap that closed very slowly. Once you depend on fields, you cannot walk away from them, and by the time the costs are apparent, there are far too many of you to go back to foraging, even if everybody wanted to. Whether Göbekli Tepe caused that transition or merely stood at its threshold, this hill marks the last moment when the older way of life was still whole. The people who raised these stones were, in a real and measurable sense, the healthiest, best-fed, and most free human beings who would live in that landscape for the next 10,000 years, and they used that freedom to build something enormous and useless and permanent. For 20 years, Göbekli Tepe was treated as unique, an unrepeatable freak of prehistory, a single inexplicable thing standing alone in an otherwise empty landscape. That is no longer true, and the change is recent enough that most people have not yet heard about it. In 2019, the Turkish authorities launched a research program across the surrounding province with a very simple premise, called Taz Tepeler, the Stone Hills. The idea was to go back to the other mounds in the region and look at them again with everything that had been learned at Göbekli Tepe, and to find out whether it had ever had company. It had. At least a dozen sites of the same period have now been identified within a radius of about 100 kilometers, and several of them contain T-shaped pillars, carved animals, and enclosures of recognizably the same family. This was not one strange hill. It was an entire landscape of them, connected by a shared language of symbol and form. At Sayburk, a carved panel on a bench shows two scenes side by side. A human figure holding his phallus and flanked by two leopards, and beside him another man facing a bull with enormous horns, holding what may be a rattle. It is one of the earliest narrative scenes, a picture that appears to be telling a story with a sequence, anywhere in the world. Sefertepe, Kakmaktepe, Kurtepesi, Göbekli, Harbetsuvin, Navali Quarry, a whole constellation of related sites, some earlier than Gobekli Tepe and some later, some large and some small, sharing pillar forms and animal imagery and construction methods across a region the size of a small country. And above all, 25 miles east of Gobekli Tepe, there is a hill called Karahan Tepe, which may in the end prove to be more remarkable than Gobekli Tepe itself. Karahan Tepe was noted in surveys in the 1990s, but was only excavated properly from 2019 onward. What has come out of it in the years since is astonishing, and it is still coming out. The excavation is very much in progress, and each season has so far produced something that changes the picture. Its central room is cut directly into the bedrock. Not built up from quarried blocks, but carved downward into the living rock of the hill, so that the floor and the walls are all one continuous piece of stone. And rising from that floor are 11 stone pillars, again not quarried and transported and raised, but left standing when everything around them was cut away. And in that room, projecting from the rock wall and looking out across those 11 pillars, is a human head with a serpent's body, a face carved in stone, with the neck extended out from the wall, gazing across the chamber. It is one of the most arresting images to survive from the Stone Age, and nobody who has seen a photograph of it forgets it. Nearby, excavators recovered a life-size statue of a seated man, hands gripping his phallus, ribs showing, expression fixed and staring. It is currently the oldest life-size statue of a human being known from anywhere on Earth, and it was carved by people who had no metal tools. What Karahan Tepe proves, beyond argument, is that Gobekli Tepe was not an isolated miracle produced by one unusual group. It was one node, perhaps the greatest node, in a whole culture that was building these things across a wide region for centuries, sharing a symbolic vocabulary that everybody understood. And that changes the question entirely. It is no longer, how did one strange band of hunter-gatherers manage this? It is, what were all of these people, across all of these hills, doing together, and what on earth did they believe? Let us go back into the ring of pillars and ask the question directly, because everything else on this hill is arranged around it. Who are the figures? The evidence is limited, but it is quite specific, and it is worth setting out plainly before we start guessing. They are human in shape. Head, body, arms bending at the elbow, long-fingered hands meeting at the front, a belt with a buckle, and below the belt something that looks like an animal skin apron. They are enormously tall, 3 to 5 times the height of a person. They have no faces. They stand in a ring facing inward, with 2 greater ones at the center. The first and most widely held reading is that they are ancestors. Everything else at this site points toward a preoccupation with the dead. The carved and drilled skulls, the vultures with their wings spread, the headless human figure on Pillar 43, the total absence of ordinary burials. A circle of towering ancestors gathered around 2 of the very greatest of them is a coherent picture, and it fits the material. The second reading is that they are gods or spirits or beings who were never human at all, and that the facelessness is precisely the point, because such beings are not to be depicted directly. It is worth noting that several later religions of this exact region carry that prohibition explicitly, forbidding any image of the divine face. Whether that is a distant inheritance or a coincidence, nobody can say. The third reading is more social than religious. The pillars may represent clans or lineages, each one standing for a particular group of people, each carved with the animal that belonged to that group, all of them gathered in a circle around a shared center. On that reading, an enclosure is not a temple at all. It is a map of who these people were and how they fitted together. There is a small but real piece of evidence for the third reading, and it is the one we noted earlier. The animals differ systematically between enclosures. Snakes in A, foxes in B, boar in C. If each enclosure belonged to a different group or was built by one, that pattern makes immediate sense, and it would explain why they kept building new ones instead of simply enlarging the old. And there is a fourth possibility, which we should not dismiss merely because it is uncomfortable to sit with, that these figures are something for which we have no category at all. That they belong to a system of thought so unlike our own that every word we reach for, God, ancestor, spirit, clan, totem, is equally and completely wrong, and we are simply putting our own furniture into their room. 11,600 years is a very long time. The distance between us and these builders is nearly twice the distance between us and the first pharaoh of Egypt. Everything we have ever recorded about how human beings think, every myth, every scripture, every philosophy, every name of every god, fits comfortably into the second half of that gap. Whatever furnished the minds of these people, we should not assume we would recognize the furniture. What we can say with confidence is small, but it is not nothing. They made beings taller than themselves. They gave them human arms and human hands and no faces. They made them out of the most permanent material available. They arranged them in a circle that gathers around a center. And they went on doing it in the same form with the same conventions for more than 1,000 years, which means somebody was teaching somebody else how it was done, generation after generation, and being believed. And then they filled it in. This is the fact that troubles archaeologists more than any other, because it is the hardest to explain in any ordinary way. At some point around 800 BC, the enclosures were packed to the top with rubble, limestone fragments, flint debris, broken tools, animal bone, and earth. It was done by hand. It was done deliberately. And the amount of labor involved is comparable to the labor of building the things in the first place. It is not collapse, and this matters because collapse would be a much more comfortable explanation. Collapse leaves a very different signature in the ground. Walls fallen inward, a layer of wind-blown silt building up slowly over a floor, roots, animal burrows, gradual accumulation across centuries. What is in these enclosures is dense, rapid, intentional fill, brought from somewhere else and heaped in until the space no longer existed. And some of the enclosures appear to have been closed and buried while others were still in use, with new ones built above and beside them. It happened repeatedly across centuries, a cycle of raising a circle, using it for some period of time, and then deliberately putting it out of existence and starting again somewhere adjacent. So why would anyone bury something that took 500 people to build? One explanation is that the burial was itself the final ritual, that an enclosure had a lifespan like a living thing, and that at the end of that span the correct and respectful act was to lay it to rest rather than let it stand empty and neglected. This is not an exotic idea. A great many cultures dismantle or bury sacred objects ceremonially rather than allow them to decay in the open. Another is that an enclosure belonged to a particular generation or to particular people, and that when those people were gone the place went with them, closed and covered, its work finished, while a new circle was raised for those who came after. That would explain the repeated cycle rather neatly, and it would fit a culture that was clearly preoccupied with ancestors and the dead. A third possibility is more prosaic and has gained ground in recent years, that the fill is not a single ceremonial act at all, but the accumulated debris of continuous activity, waste from feasting, stoneworking chips, food remains, heaped up around and eventually over the structures across centuries of use. The truth may well be a mixture of the deliberate and the gradual. And there is a fourth explanation that we cannot test and probably never will, that they wanted it hidden. That something changed, a belief abandoned, a disaster suffered, a defeat, a decision taken by people whose reasoning is entirely lost, and that the correct response was to put these stones out of sight permanently, and to make sure nobody found them. Whatever the reason, the effect was preservation on a scale that has no parallel. Everything else built above ground 11,000 years ago has been ground to dust by rain and frost and root and wind. This survived because it was packed in dry rubble and sealed beneath a hill in a dry climate, and so the carvings kept their edges and the pillars kept their footings. The people who buried Göbekli Tepe handed it down to us complete. They almost certainly did not mean to, and if they knew what we had done with it, it is not at all obvious that they would be pleased. It is worth standing back to consider what this hill tells us about the people themselves, not about their buildings or their beliefs, but about their minds, and about what human beings were already capable of before any of the things we call civilization existed. They could plan across generations. A project on this scale continued for 1,600 years with the same forms, the same symbols and the same conventions, requires transmitting intentions to people who had not yet been born, through nothing but speech and demonstration and repetition. Somebody in 9600 BC started something that somebody in 800 BC was still faithfully continuing. They could organize labor at scale without any of the mechanisms we assume are necessary for it. No writing to keep records or issue instructions. No money to pay anyone. No state. No standing authority that we can detect anywhere in the archaeology. There is no palace on this hill, no elite burial, no house grander than any other house, no sign of anybody who could compel anybody else. They had abstraction, and this is easy to underestimate. A T-shaped pillar is not a statue of a person. It is a symbol of a person, a human form reduced to its bare essentials and then repeated in a standardized way across a whole region for 1,000 years. That is a genuinely sophisticated operation of mind, and it is the same operation that eventually produces writing. They shared symbols across long distances. The same animal vocabulary, the same H-shaped emblem, the same distinctive pillar form appear at sites 100 kilometers apart and centuries apart. Something was traveling between these hills that was not trade goods and not people carrying objects. Ideas were moving, and they were moving intact, which means somebody was teaching them carefully. They had craft skill of a very high order. Quarrying, undercutting, transporting, raising, relief carving, sculpture in the round, using nothing but stone, wood, bone, fiber, and fire. And as we have seen, they were already extremely good at it in the very earliest layers, which means the learning happened somewhere we have not found. And they had whatever it is in human beings that makes them do enormous, costly, entirely impractical things because those things feel necessary. That impulse is older than farming, older than cities, older than writing, older than metal, older than every institution we have. It may be the single oldest thing about us that a person today would still recognize immediately as their own. We have spent a long time telling ourselves that civilization is what made us capable of great works. This hill suggests something close to the opposite. That the capacity came first, that it was there in people who owned nothing but stone tools and each other, and that civilization was one of the things that capacity eventually produced. Something should be said about Klaus Schmidt because sites like this are found by particular people who make particular choices, and he gave this one the whole of the rest of his life. He was born in Bavaria in 1953 and became fascinated by prehistory as a boy, collecting flints from plowed fields. He trained at Erlangen and Heidelberg, and through the 1980s he worked in Turkey at Navel Quarry, the settlement in the Euphrates Valley that would eventually be drowned by the Ataturk Dam. It was there that he first encountered T-shaped pillars, in a smaller and later form, in a building set into a hillside. So when he read the 1963 survey note about limestone slabs on a hill near Saint-Lierfa, he was very possibly the only person alive who would immediately have understood what it might mean. He had held the material in his hands. He knew the shape. Everything about the story turns on that coincidence of the right man reading the right paragraph. He was, by every account of those who worked with him, an unusually careful excavator. He dug slowly. He resisted the constant pressure from funders, from journalists, from his own curiosity to open more of the site faster, arguing that archaeologists a century from now would have techniques he could not imagine and ought to be left something to use them on. That is why 95% of Göbekli Tepe is still buried today. It was a deliberate gift to people not yet born. He was also willing to be wrong in public, which is rarer than it should be. He put forward the argument that the temple came before farming, knowing perfectly well that it contradicted a century of orthodoxy and would be attacked, and he defended and refined it for 2 decades while the evidence accumulated. He learned Turkish. He worked with the same villagers season after season and trained many of them. He pushed hard for the site's legal protection long before it was famous, and largely because of that work, Göbekli Tepe was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2018. He died in July 2014, suddenly, of a heart attack while swimming on holiday in Germany. He was 60 years old. The excavation season was about to begin, and he had been intending to open a new trench. The work goes on without him, conducted by the people he trained, a few square meters at a time, with the same deliberate slowness he insisted on. There is enough left on that hill to occupy 100 years of archaeologists who have not yet been born, and every one of them will be working on the site because one man read an old footnote and decided to drive out and look. Which brings us to what is still down there in the dark. Ground-penetrating radar and magnetic survey have now mapped the buried portions of the hill without disturbing so much as a handful of soil, and the resulting picture is clear enough to be startling. There are at least 15 more enclosures beneath the unexcavated ground, and something in the order of 200 further pillars, lying exactly as they were left in the centuries around 800 BC. At the current rate of excavation, uncovering all of it would take well over a century. And that pace is entirely deliberate because archaeology has a peculiar problem that other sciences do not. It destroys its own evidence as it gathers it. Every trench dug is a piece of the site that can never be dug again, and every question you do not know to ask is a question that can never be asked of that soil. So the policy on this hill is patience. Excavate a small amount. Record it exhaustively. Publish carefully. Preserve everything else, and trust that the people who come afterwards will be able to read things in that ground that we cannot currently see at all: chemical residues, ancient DNA from the fill, microscopic plant remains, techniques nobody has invented yet. Since 2018, the excavated enclosures have stood beneath a great tensile canopy, sheltered from rain and sun, with raised walkways carrying visitors above and around them. The hill now receives hundreds of thousands of people a year. Turkey declared 2019 the year of Göbekli Tepe, and the site has become one of the most visited archaeological destinations in the country. There is a genuine tension in that, and it is worth naming. This place survived for 10,000 years precisely because nobody touched it and nobody knew. It is now the most visited Stone Age site on Earth, and every single visitor represents a small pressure on it. Footfall, vibration, humidity, the slow costs of being looked at. But the alternative, leaving it entirely alone and telling nobody, would mean that the moment when human beings first built something enormous for a reason that was not survival would remain unknown to the species that did it. That moment does not belong to archaeologists. It belongs to everybody, including the people queuing on the walkway in the heat. So the hill is opened slowly and covered and monitored. And beneath the walkways, under a meter or two of packed rubble that somebody carried up there by hand 100 centuries ago, 200 carved figures go on standing in their circles in the dark, facing inward, waiting to be looked at again. It is worth gathering the open questions into one place, because an honest inventory of our ignorance is the most interesting thing this site has to offer, and because every one of these gaps is a place where somebody may yet find something. We do not know what the pillars represent. Ancestors, gods, spirits, clans, something else entirely. Every reading is a reasonable guess consistent with a small amount of evidence, and none of them can be demonstrated. We do not know what the animals mean, or why they carved predators and venomous creatures and scavengers while almost entirely ignoring the gazelle that they actually ate. We do not know why the pillars have no faces, in a culture demonstrably capable of carving a fox's snarl and a crane's eye in fine relief on the very same stone. We do not know what the H-shaped emblem is. It appears again and again around the necks of the great central figures on other pillars at other sites, used consistently across a region and across centuries. It clearly carried a specific and shared meaning, and that meaning is completely gone. We do not know what the symbols carved on the belt of Pillar 18 say, or whether say is even the right verb for them. They are evenly spaced and clearly deliberate. They are not writing as we understand it. They may be something on the road toward it. We do not know how they moved 50-ton stones. We know only that it must have involved timber, rope, levers, and very large numbers of people because there is nothing else available. We do not know who organized any of it. There is no palace on that hill, no elite burial, no house larger than any other, no insignia of office, no sign whatsoever of a chief or a priesthood. Either the leadership left no physical trace at all, or it operated in some way for which we do not have a model. We do not know whether people lived on the hill or only visited it, and the answer to that has been shifting for a decade as new evidence comes out of the ground. We do not know why they buried it. And we do not know whether there is something older still. The oldest enclosures are the most accomplished, which strongly suggests the skill was developed somewhere else on something earlier. If a first attempt exists, a place where people worked out how to do this, then it lies unexcavated under one of the many hundreds of mounds in that landscape, and somebody may walk over it this year without knowing. That is a very great deal of not knowing for a site that has been under continuous excavation for 30 years. It is also, in a way, exactly the point. This is the outer edge of what archaeology can currently reach, and beyond it there is only silence, and the objects themselves standing there. Because so much is genuinely unknown, Göbekli Tepe has become a screen onto which people project, and it is worth walking through the popular theories calmly rather than pretending they do not exist. The most widespread is that this is the Garden of Eden. The reasoning is not absurd. The site lies in the right general region, not far from the headwaters of the Tigris and the Euphrates, and it stands precisely at the moment when humanity moved from foraging to farming, from a world of abundance gathered freely to a world of labor in the fields. As a metaphor that has real force, and Klaus Schmidt himself acknowledged the resonance. The Eden story describes people who once lived without agriculture and were then condemned to earn their bread by the sweat of their brow, which is a fair poetic description of what actually happened in this landscape. But as history, it claims a great deal more than the evidence can support, and the Genesis text was written some 8,000 years later. Then there is the lost civilization theory, that the sophistication of the carvings proves that survivors of an earlier and more advanced culture must have taught these skills to the hunter-gatherers. The difficulty is that there is no trace of any such culture anywhere, and that the carvings, while excellent, are precisely what skilled stoneworkers with flint tools and generations of practice would be expected to produce. The comet theory we have already met. The claim that Pillar 43 records a cosmic impact around 10,900 BC. It was published in a peer-reviewed engineering journal and covered enthusiastically all over the world, and it has been criticized in detail by the specialists who work on the site, on grounds of arbitrary constellation matching and dating that does not fit. And there are ancient astronaut claims, which need no rebuttal beyond a walk around the site. The quarries are there. The hammerstones are there by the thousand, many of them broken from use. The half-finished pillar is still attached to the bedrock along one edge, showing exactly how far the work had got when it stopped. We can see precisely how this was made. It was made by people slowly by hitting rock with other rock. The reason to be careful about all of this is not pedantry, and it is not a defense of professional territory. It is that the fantastical versions are smaller and less interesting than the truth. Aliens Did It is a much duller story than hunter-gatherers did it, and we have no idea why, and they were exactly as intelligent as we are. The genuinely astonishing thing about Göbekli Tepe is not that it might have been built by somebody else. It is that it was built by us, by ordinary human beings with ordinary human brains, at the very beginning, before writing and metal and the wheel and the field, using nothing but stone and rope and cooperation and whatever it was they believed. Let us put the hill back into the long sweep of what followed, because everything that came afterwards grew out of the same few valleys. Within 2,000 years of Göbekli Tepe's burial, this region had farming villages of several hundred people, fired pottery, woven cloth, and domesticated sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs. The whole toolkit of the Neolithic was in place, and people were living in the same house their grandparents had lived in. Within 4,000 years, there were towns of several thousand inhabitants, copper being worked, irrigation channels being cut, and long-distance trade in metal and stone running for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. Within 6,000 years, down on the southern plains, there were cities, Uruk, Uar, Eridu, with temples raised on platforms, with kings, with standing armies, with taxation, with property law, and with, around 3200 BC, the first writing in human history, invented not for poetry or scripture, but to keep track of who owed how much grain to whom. And every one of those things depended on the one before it. The city requires the surplus. The surplus requires the field. The field requires the domesticated seed. and the domesticated seed came out of these particular hills, on the slopes of that particular dark mountain, at very nearly the same moment as these particular stones were being raised. Which produces a fact worth pausing on. The distance in time from Göbekli Tepe to the invention of writing is about 6,400 years. The distance from the invention of writing to us is about 5,200. This hill is further from the first written word than the first written word is from you. We stand at one end of a very long line, and this hill stands at the other end of it, and everything that human beings have ever recorded about themselves stands somewhere in between. And at that far end there is no king, no priest with a name, no army, no writing, no bread, no metal, no will, only several hundred people hauling a stone up a slope in the autumn, because there was something they had agreed together needed doing. Let us imagine one gathering carefully, inventing nothing that the evidence does not permit. It is autumn sometime around 9500 BC, and the light is going early now. The gazelle have begun to move across the plain, and the word has gone out along the valleys, carried by people walking over days, that the time has come. Groups arrive from every direction. 20 from one valley, 40 from another, families and cousins and near strangers, some of whom have been traveling for the better part of a week and are arriving footsore and hungry. They camp on the slopes below the enclosures, in shelters of hide and brush thrown up in an afternoon. There is no water on the hill, so it is carried up from the springs below in skins and bladders, in a chain of people that continues all day and every day for as long as the gathering lasts. The hunting begins early. Gazelle are driven along the valleys toward waiting spears in a coordinated operation that requires dozens of people who have done it before and know their parts. An aurochs is taken, with great difficulty and a great deal of noise and probably some injury, and the story of that particular bull will be told at this hill for years. Grain gathered from the wild stands on the surrounding slopes is soaked in the great limestone basins near the enclosures. Whatever happens to it in there, and the residue chemistry suggests fermentation, takes several days, and people check it and stir it and know from long experience when it is ready. And there is work. The quarry rings from first light with the flat knocking sound of hammerstones on limestone, a sound that carries a long way across open country. A pillar begun the previous autumn is being finished. Its carvings are cut by a few practiced pairs of hands while everybody else hauls or cooks or watches or gets in the way. When the moment comes to move it, everybody is needed. Ropes are laid out along the track. Timber rollers are set. Somebody who has done this before calls the rhythm, and 300 or 500 people take the strain together, and the stone slides forward the length of a hand, and then stops, and then again. Takes days. There are injuries, crushed feet, torn hands, at least sometimes worse. And when the pillar finally stands upright in its socket and the ropes go slack and the props come away, something happens in that crowd that any of us would recognize instantly if we could be there, though we cannot hear it across 11,500 years. Then the feast. Meat roasted in quantity over open fires, the bones cracked for marrow and thrown down into the fill where archaeologists will find them. The basins opened. the fires burning inside the ring of figures as the light goes, and the carved animals seeming to shift and move on the pillars as the shadows change across the relief. And in the middle of all of it, in the dark, the two great Faceless Ones stand 5.5 meters tall on their pedestals, arms bent, long hands meeting above their belts, looking at nothing at all, exactly as they will still be standing, in exactly that posture, when the hill is opened again in the autumn of 1994. Afterwards, people go home. Marriages have been arranged. Disputes have been settled or at least postponed. Obsidian has changed hands. News has traveled. Somebody's grandmother has been remembered properly. And a stone has been raised that will outlast every single person present by more than 10,000 years. And in the spring the grass grows back over the churned ground and the ashes, and the hill is quiet again, and stays quiet until the herds come back and it is time. So what does it mean, this hill? It means, first of all, that we were wrong about ourselves. The capacity for shared belief, for organized labor, for monumental art, for abstract symbol, none of it arrived with civilization. All of it was already there, complete, in people who owned nothing but stone tools and fire and each other, and who had never planted a seed. It means that the story of how we became what we are does not begin with a field. It begins, or at least it turns, on a bare hill where several hundred people gathered for a reason that we cannot recover and probably would not understand if we could. It means that the oldest thing human beings built on a monumental scale that has survived was not a house, not a wall, not a granary, not a tomb for a ruler, and not a fortification. It was a circle of figures, standing together, facing inward. And it means that we are related to those people far more closely than the number of years suggests. They planned, organized, argued, celebrated, mourned, carved beautiful things, drank together, kept the skulls of their dead and buried their own monuments. Take one of them out of that circle and set them down in a room with us, and the distance would be very much smaller than 11,500 years implies. There are things about this place that will not be resolved in our lifetimes, and quite possibly not ever. The pillars will keep their meaning. The animals will not explain themselves. The reason for the burial stays buried with it. But the hill is still there, low and rounded above the plain, with the wind moving across it exactly as it always has. Beneath the canopy, the excavated stones stand in their rings. And below them, still sealed, 200 more wait in the dark. The people who made them had no writing, and so they left us no words at all, not one. What they left instead were figures taller than themselves, standing in a circle with their hands folded, and the sheer fact that they bothered. That is what survives. Not a name, not a language, not a god we could identify if we heard it spoken. Only the evidence that once, at the very beginning, before there were fields or cities or kings or writing, human beings decided together that something mattered enough to move mountains for, and then went and did it. And they were right about one thing at least, though they could not possibly have known it. 11,600 years later, we are still here, still standing on that hill, still looking at what they made, still trying to work out what they meant. The tools are still lying in the quarry where they were dropped. The half-cut pillar is still there, attached to the bedrock along one edge, shaped on 3 sides and abandoned, waiting to be finished by people who never came back for it. The great limestone basins are still standing, empty now, exactly where they were left. And the 2 tall ones at the center of Enclosure D are still standing side by side on their pedestals, with their long hands meeting above their belts, faceless and patient, looking out at whoever comes. The hunters who raised them are gone. The language they spoke is gone completely, without a single word surviving. The songs that must have been sung on that hill on those autumn nights, with hundreds of people camped on the slopes, are gone without leaving any trace at all. The gazelle are gone too. The herds that once crossed those plains in their thousands were hunted down the centuries until they thinned, and then dwindled, and then vanished from that region entirely. But the wild wheat is still there, on the slopes of Karahan, the same grass, in the same thin soil, ancestor of very nearly every loaf of bread that has ever been eaten by anybody, growing quietly on a dark hill 30 kilometers away. And the hill keeps its shape, low and round against the sky, just as it did through all those thousands of years when nobody on earth knew what was inside it. If you stood up there tonight, there would be very little to hear. Wind moving through dry grass. Perhaps a dog somewhere down in the valley. A vehicle on the distant road. The stones themselves do not make any sound at all and never have. That is the whole story of Göbekli Tepe. 11,600 years, from a circle of hunters on a bare hilltop to a canopy and a walkway and a queue of visitors in the heat, with a very long silence in the middle, when the hill was only a hill and the figures stood in the dark and nobody alive remembered that they were there. Nothing is asked of you now. The excavation is closed for the night. The canopy is empty and the walkways are dark. There is nobody at all on the hill. Sleep well. The stones have waited a very long time, and they are in no hurry whatsoever.